2:47 a.m. English Channel. The tanker Smyrtus was moving steadily through the dark water when an unusual signal appeared on the radar screen, following close behind. The distance between the two vessels kept shrinking. Minutes later, the signal was identified as British RHIBs. But instead of changing direction or increasing speed, Smyrtus stayed on its original route, almost as if it was allowing them to come closer. And if the situation continued like this, what would happen next? Western intelligence services and alliance satellites had been tracking Smyrtus as it crossed the English Channel. Although several details looked unusual, there was still not enough authority to stop the vessel in international waters. To carry out a direct inspection, a Royal Navy Type 26 escort ship was ordered to follow Smyrtus, while an elite British boarding team moved in by RHIB under the cover of darkness. At first, everything seemed completely routine. Smyrtus held its course, sent no warning, and showed no visible activity on deck. But as the distance closed, everything changed. 2:55 a.m., large sections of Smyrtus's hull suddenly opened, revealing hidden compartments built into the vessel. Before the British team could react, mechanical launch systems lowered toward the surface of the water. 8 high-speed boats dropped from inside the ship and hit the waves one after another. Their engines roared across the channel as they surged forward, leaving long white trails behind them. In that moment, the British team understood the truth. They were no longer approaching a suspicious tanker. They had stepped into a carefully prepared trap. As soon as the 8 boats emerged from Smyrtus, the situation in the English Channel became far more dangerous. The boarding team was forced to abandon the inspection plan and shift into evasive movement as the fast craft closed in from several directions. Farther back, the Type 26 frigate continued tracking the tanker while maintaining contact with the RHIB team moving through the darkness. At the same time, a squadron of A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft received new orders to change course and head toward the scene at maximum speed. 3:11 a.m. As the pressure around the British team increased, more hidden sections of Smyrtus began to open. Around 12 dark, unmanned aerial craft rose into the night sky at the same time, then shifted direction and moved toward the British crews. The boarding unit was now caught between threats from above and fast-moving boats on every side. Each evasive turn created a new gap, and every gap brought the pursuing craft closer. The plan seemed built to overwhelm the British team from every angle at once. The Type 26 frigate tracked several moving targets, but it still held its response. There was no clear path through the SBS formation, and any wrong move could put the crews below at risk. Minute by minute, the circle around them grew smaller. More drone signatures appeared across the tactical display, while the fast boats continued pressing in from every direction. For a short time, the group from Smyrtus controlled the entire scene. 3:20 a.m. The first A-10s finally arrived over the English Channel, but even their arrival was not enough to break the trap. The fast boats had moved so close to the SBS unit that the aircraft could not safely engage. From above, the pilots could clearly see the moving targets below, but the distance between friend and foe was too narrow. As the A-10 circled, searching for a clean approach route, the surrounding force continued to tighten its grip. At the same time, an EA-18G Growler taking part in NATO training was redirected toward the area, prepared to assist if the situation escalated further. A squadron of A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft cut through the low clouds at high speed, racing toward the English Channel as their engines echoed through the night. From above, the scene looked like a storm of moving lights. SBS boats were trying to break away, fast craft were closing in from every side, and the number of drones overhead was growing thicker by the second. 3:32 a.m. Just as the A-10s began moving into position, the boats below suddenly changed formation. Several of them broke away and rushed directly toward the SBS cluster, reducing the distance until both sides were almost blended together in the same field of view. Then the launch compartments on the boats opened, and portable air defense systems were brought online. A flash cut through the darkness. Projectiles rose from the surface of the sea and streaked upward toward the A-10s. The formation reacted instantly. The aircraft split apart, released countermeasures, and began sharp evasive turns. One aircraft banked hard to the left. Another climbed suddenly to break away from the incoming threat. The airspace above the English Channel turned into a chaotic pattern of pursuit and escape. Seconds later, drones began dropping into the same crowded zone, adding even more pressure to the pilots and crews below. The A-10s attempted to use short, controlled passes to slow the boats on the surface, but every approach carried enormous risk. The fast craft had moved too close to the SBS formation, making every decision more difficult. 3:41 a.m. The AGM-65 Maverick systems were placed on standby, but every possible route kept changing as the boats moved back and forth around the British crews. In those critical moments, the aircraft sent to stabilize the situation were forced to focus on staying clear of danger inside a tactical space that was rapidly falling apart. Below, the boats continued closing the circle around the British team. Above them, bright trails and countermeasures cut across the night sky, turning the entire scene into a broken maze of movement. Everything was happening inside one narrow corridor. Aircraft, surface craft, and subsurface contacts were now operating in the same crowded space, leaving almost no room for error. As the boats carrying portable air defense systems were gradually forced out of the surface fight, Smertis immediately shifted to another layer of its plan. From the outside, nothing seemed to change. But beneath the tanker's upper structure, hidden electronic modules came online at the same time, releasing a wave of interference across the entire engagement area. 3:50 a.m. On board the Type 26, the monitoring screens began to glitch. The SBS signal split into two separate tracks, then drifted away from its real position for several seconds. The automatic tracking system kept locking, losing the target, and locking again. Inside the operations room, warning lights flashed non-stop as the crew struggled to understand which signals were real and which were not. Above the channel, the A-10 formation continued its pattern, but the pilots soon began seeing unstable information on their displays. Navigation cues flickered. Target data shifted. One aircraft had to climb sharply when the information below no longer matched the actual movement on the water. Another pilot switched to a more basic data mode, sacrificing link quality in order to keep the aircraft steady and under control. On the surface, the SBS boats were also being forced into constant course changes. One RHIB made a sudden turn to avoid a contact that appeared to be sliding left on the screen, even though the object was actually still moving straight ahead. The fast craft used that brief moment of confusion to push deeper into the gaps between the British boats, shrinking the distance by dozens of meters with every maneuver. 3:54 a.m. The EA-18G Growler entered the interference zone and activated its full electronic scanning suite. Its systems began rebuilding the signal picture, separating the overlapping emissions coming from Smertis layer by layer. Within seconds, a main emission cluster was identified. The Growler shifted into direct electronic countermeasure mode, pushing pressure back toward the source. Smertis responded almost instantly. The lock signal disappeared from the scan, then reappeared in several false positions at once, pulling the analysis system away from the real origin point. The Growler had to keep switching frequency bands, following each fragment as the signal scattered across the spectrum. Then, for one brief moment, the tracking loop became tight enough. The primary source on Smertis was held in place. The lock was confirmed, and the enhanced electronic beam was aimed precisely at that location. As the pressure reached its highest point, Smertis transmitted one final coded pulse. It flashed for only a second, cutting through the thick interference, then moved in a fixed direction toward the open sea. A moment later, it vanished from every monitoring screen. Only minutes after the encrypted signal from Smertis disappeared from the tracking system, the Type 26 detected new movement beneath the surface. The Type 26's sonar began showing underwater contacts moving rapidly toward the formation. Above the area, the A-10 squadron was still holding patrol after the earlier clash with the surface boats. As soon as the sonar data from the Type 26 was shared, the aircraft spread out and shifted lower, scanning the sea surface for any visible signs hidden among the moving water and the clutter below. 4:05 a.m. The underwater contacts kept gaining speed. They did not surface. They did not turn away. They moved straight ahead through the water, cutting forward like sharp lines on the display. The Type 26 immediately turned its sensors toward the approaching tracks and sent a full area alert to the SBS teams. Moments later, a Merlin HM2 lifted from the ship's deck. Before the aircraft had fully settled into position, it began releasing sonar buoys in a steady pattern across the water. On the combat display, separate underwater contacts started to appear, but they kept splitting apart and coming back together again, as if searching for a weakness in the tracking net. The A-10s then moved in to assist. Two aircraft dropped to a lower altitude, flying along the engagement line and using their optical sensors to scan the sea surface in the low light. From above, the pilots began noticing strange movement on the water. These were not normal waves, but long-spreading disturbances that matched the sonar tracks moving below. One A-10 descended slightly farther while keeping a safe distance from the SBS area. It began marking the suspected zone to help guide the Type 26. But just as the search areas were being narrowed down, the underwater contacts suddenly changed speed. One group surged across the SBS team's path, while another broke away, trying to slip between the Merlin's sonar coverage zones. On board the Type 26, the sonar picture became crowded with crossing tracks. The Merlin HM2 released more buoys, building a tighter detection network ahead of the formation. The underwater contacts continued pushing into the scan zone, trying to break through each new layer of control as the net closed around them. 4:18 a.m. The A-10s remained overhead, circling and staying in contact with the Type 26 while keeping direct visual watch on the sea surface. The sonar picture was changing second by second, and no one could afford to lose track of the movement below. Every possible route was now being watched. The air, the surface, and the water were all closing into one narrow tactical space. For a brief moment, the section of the English Channel ahead of the SBS team became a complete choke point, where every movement was being tracked from above, across the surface, and below the water at the same time. When the final defensive line across the surface and underwater zone was pushed through, Smertus shifted into a protective posture. No more boats were released from the ship, and no additional drones appeared in the sky. Everything that remained was now centered on the vessel itself. Antenna arrays, communication units, and swarm control equipment still trying to keep the wider system connected. Above the channel, the A-10 squadron immediately dropped lower, focusing on the clearly visible emission points along the ship's deck. One by one, the aircraft marked each section: the forward communication cluster, the central sensor array, and the exposed control equipment running across the structure. Once the targets were confirmed, the AGM-65 Mavericks left their rails and moved toward the ship in steady, controlled paths. A rapid series of impacts tore across Smertus's deck. The signal-transmitting antenna groups were taken out step by step. With every hit, the command network weakened further, cutting the remaining links between the vessel and the units it had already released. On the tactical displays, the remaining signals from the fast craft began to fade and break apart. The drones lost synchronization, slipped out of formation, and drifted away from their original paths. Without command signals and without coordinated instructions, the entire surrounding force began falling apart in the middle of the operation. 4:35 a.m., Smertus was now completely isolated. No data was leaving the ship, no tactical response came from inside. The vessel drifted slowly through the English Channel like a massive piece of metal that had lost control of its own systems. The Type 26 moved into a control position, while the SBS rebuilt a secure perimeter around the area. Boarding teams entered the vessel, sealed the remaining technical sections and command spaces, and recovered data from the modules that had stayed intact. Smertus was then towed to a British military port under close supervision. The information pulled from its internal systems was examined layer by layer. What investigators found pointed to a structure far more advanced than anything expected from an ordinary oil tanker. Early analysis suggested that Smertus was not simply a commercial vessel. It appeared to be a disguised swarm-carrying platform, built to operate quietly among normal shipping traffic while hiding a much larger purpose. And if similar platforms are still out there, moving unnoticed through busy sea routes, one question now hangs over NATO command centers. Was this truly the end of the incident, or was it only the first visible piece of a much larger hidden network?